Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Robert Green. I'm a program manager in the evangelism group. That's what PME stands for in DX, which is the evangelism group at Microsoft. And today's talk is going to be on DevOps. And it's about how using DevOps practices can make you a better developer. So we will explain what DevOps is. We will explain what we mean by making you a better developer. If you have any questions about this or anything at all, please don't hesitate to email me. There's my Twitter handle. I'm also the host of a show on Channel 9 called Visual Studio Toolbox, which if you haven't checked out, I, of course, highly recommend. So our goal for this session is to get a sense of what DevOps is and why. What is this CI/CD pipeline that everybody talks about? How do you do it and why? And how do you get started using DevOps? And the way I like to think about it is, and I think about this not only for DevOps, but everything we introduce. We are constantly shipping new stuff, UWP and containers and bots and DevOps and Xamarin and React and this and that. And for everything we've released, there's 5 or 6 more things in the pipeline that'll be released this year. And how do you keep up on these things? It's a very, very daunting task. Has anyone discovered that? Of course. But what I have discovered, and I've been in this business a lot longer than I'll ever admit, is that very little is all that hard once you demystify it and figure out what is it, why was it invented, what challenges is it solving, and how do you get started using it. And then at that point, you can just go learn the rest. And that's what we're going to do in this session today. And I kind of liken it to learning how to ski. Right, you strap on some skis and you go to a ski resort and you start out on the green runs. That's the bunny slope. And you are not a skier if you're on the green run. You're not a skier yet. If you have to take the magic carpet up to the top and then kind of traverse down flat ground, you're learning how to ski, but you're not a skier yet. Your goal is to get off the green slope and get on the blue runs. And if you can make it to ride the lift up to a blue run, ski down to the bottom, not kill yourself, have fun and want to do it again, you are a skier. Are you a good skier yet? Of course not. But you now know enough about skiing to go take more lessons, practice, and get to the point where you can get to the black diamonds, and if you're really an expert, get to the double black diamonds. And we see people doing DevOps like Donovan Brown and James Montemagno and others, and they're these black diamond, double black diamond guys doing all these fancy tricks, and we're like, I don't know how to do that. And so the goal of this session is to show you that you actually very, very quickly can learn how to start doing that, and then we're all smart people, we can figure out the rest. So that's our goal in the 75 minutes. So first, a little background, DevOps. So where we come from is a world where we do releases with a large space of time between them. Think about things like Windows. How often did Windows ship? There was a big release, and then a while later was Service Pack 1, and then a while later was Service Pack 2, and then a while later was Service Pack 3, which is the one that everyone started using, right? Because you never use anything until SP3 comes out. And then there was a long wait until the next version came out. Same thing with Visual Studio. There was Visual Studio 2012 and 2013, which was like 18 months later, and 2015, which was 18 months later, and then 2017, which was 18 months later. And there's good sides and bad sides about that. The good side is you do a bunch of coding and testing, and then you deliver this big thing that everybody gets excited about, and then you can go back to fixing all the bugs and adding all the features, and people leave you alone until it's next time to release. But the problem is they don't leave you alone. They tell you things like, oh, there are bugs. Oh, there are features that are missing. Oh, we didn't get to this feature because shipping is a feature too, but we can't add it until the next version 18 months from now. That's not optimal, right? It seems on the face of it like that might be the way to go, but if you think about it, it really isn't. And in today's world, where the apps on your phone are updating constantly, and where people are starting to expect that they don't have to sit around and wait 2 years for you to add a feature, right? I just want to change the text on a button because it's confusing. Do I really need to wait 9 months until Service Pack 1 comes out to change the text on a button? If the answer is yes, that's probably not an ideal answer. right? So we've kind of moved from this world of big, chunky releases that are far apart to, some might argue that we swung the pendulum the other direction. At Build 2 weeks ago, we released Visual Studio for Mac to general availability the very same day. Update 1 was already in preview. Now, you might argue that that's too fast a cadence. So you get to decide where you want the cadence. But what we want is to get to a world where we're able to respond more quickly and get more incremental updates out to continuously be delivering additional value. And what makes that possible is DevOps. Now, if you ask people what is DevOps, there's a million different answers. It's a job title, it's automation, it's faster and smaller releases, it's the marriage of developers and operations, it's a whole bunch of things. And there are DevOps practices, and this is an extremely scary slide. Oh my God, you're looking at this and you're thinking, I thought you said this wasn't double black diamond. I thought you said we were going to get off the bunny slope, right? I mean, this is aerial tricks where people are jumping and spinning around and landing. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm not either. I'm going to stick to a handful of small pieces, continuous integration, continuous deployment. We're just going to handle the basics of it today, and then there's all this additional stuff that you can learn, and of course you will learn over time as you get better and better at it. So let's simplify. It is the union of people, processes, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to end users. So DevOps will make you a better developer. It's not about, oh, you've written better code. Oh, you've finally mastered all the best practices for doing async. Oh, you now understand the difference between the various design patterns. No, it's about enabling continuous delivery of value to the end users. It's the idea that the reason we write software is to deliver value to end users. Now, the cynical among us would say the reason we write software is because they pay us to. But why do they pay us to? They pay us because we're delivering value to the end users, whether those users are the people who paid for a mobile app or they're the people in your company who are relying on you to write software to run the business so that they can do their jobs. So it's culture, it's measurement, it's automation, it's collaboration. What it's not is a product. It's not something that you install. There are tools that we're going to use that exist, but it is more about changing the way, after we write code, what happens next. So it's not really about changing the way you write code. It's changing everything that happens between when you write the code and when it winds up being used by the end users. Again, to continue to deliver value to end users. So it's basically a process. You plan increments, like in a sprint. You develop and test manageable amounts. You release, you monitor and learn, go back, rinse and repeat. Not in 18-month or 2-year cycles, and not necessarily daily, but somewhere in between, much faster, and you'll figure out what the proper cadence is. It's entirely possible, if you were releasing twice a day, that your users would get overwhelmed. And it's likely that if you're only releasing every 2 years, your users are going to be grossly underwhelmed. So somewhere in between is the sweet spot. And DevOps are the practices and the tools that give you the ability to do that. Okay, so with that, let's switch over to demo and set this up. We're going to start off in Visual Studio Team Services, or VSTS. Once it stops flickering. There we go. I said stop flickering. Is there any way to make that stop flickering? It's clearly my berating it's not working. Is it flickering over there? Yes. Well, that's one way. Okay. All right, well, while it flickers, I'll go. We're on Visual Studio Team Services, which you can sign up for, and it's free for up to 5 users. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't know, that DevOps is going to be expensive to get started, not really. VSTS, very easy to obtain. So I'm going to create a new project. Sure, please do. And I'm also talking fast because I've never actually done this talk live, and I've got 75 minutes, and I don't want to run out of time. So, and I also don't know how well the internet's going to behave. Good? Oh. Okay, well, I'll walk you through it. All right, so I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to give this project a name, and I'm going to call it Orlando DevOps. Okay, which is invalid because I probably already have one called, oh, I misspelled it. Orlando DevOps. Okay, it's all I need. Version control, I'm going to use Git. Work item process, I'll leave as agile. We're not actually going to deal with work items in this. We're just going to deal with the build and release side of it. So I'm going to create a new project. Come on in. All right, it's done. The new project's been created.
Switch to 5, please.
Cool. All right, that looks good. Great. Oh, okay. These guys are awesome. All right, so now we have a new project. Now we're ready to write code. So I'm going to clone this in Visual Studio. I click. This dialog cracks me up. Did you mean to switch apps? Yes, that's why I clicked the button that will launch Visual Studio. But you never know, I might have clicked it by accident. So it now launches Visual Studio. I happen to be using Enterprise 2017, but that doesn't mean you have to be. I, of course, highly recommend it. So now what it's going to do is fire up Visual Studio and connect back to Visual Studio Team Services and create a repo in users RO green source repos Orlando DevOps. A little tip and trick on this, it sticks it in your users folder, which is a fine place for it as long as you understand, but if you are like me and you constantly have to repave your machine because something went wrong and then you need to copy files off, it's easy to forget to copy stuff out of there, although theoretically everything in there should be in version control. So you just need to weigh whether or not you want to leave it there. Sometimes I move this to samples repos to make it a little bit easier to find. But we'll just leave it there. I'll click clone. And now what this is going to do is clone the repository locally, create a folder for that. There's no code yet. But of course, we need a local repository so that we can store code there and then send it back to Visual Studio Team Services. So it's going to do that. It's going to be connecting and talking back to VSTS and going as fast as the blazingly fast hotel internet works. That's not too bad. Okay, so now it says, you can't see that, right? So let me, where's the magnifier? Magnifier. Okay, there we go. So Visual Studio 2017 now supports folders, and so when you do this, it starts off in folder view. So what I'm going to do is click Solutions and Folders to go into Folders. There we go. Actually, I'm going to go into Team Explorer. That works even better. Oops. What's the shortcut for turning on the magnifier? Does anybody remember? Okay. All right, so I can create a new project or solution in this repository. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to create just a simple MVC application. And the reason I'm doing this is because I think that when we do demos of new things like containers and some of the DevOps, all you ever see people do is .NET Core applications and ASP.NET Core applications. And I fear and I worry that sometimes we leave people with the impression that all this new stuff we're creating only works with the latest and greatest version of the framework and the tools, and that's just completely false. So I'm going to create a good old-fashioned MVC application here. And I'm going to create unit tests. I'm going to add unit tests because I want this to have unit tests. And I'm going to build this. And again, I'm doing this because we're starting from scratch. I will show you in a little bit what you can do if you have an existing application already. But for our purposes here, and to basically, because we're just starting out, I want to show you that there's no smoke, there's no mirrors. Okay, so creates the application, creates the tests. Okay, perfect. All right, close that down. Let's build it. Which brings down the NuGet packages. Okay, perfect. Now, because I created tests, there are actually tests in here. Let's run it. Run the tests. They all pass, as you would hope, since it's just created from a template. And so now I'm going to send this code back to the server. I go to Changes. I enter as a comment initial commit. I click Commit All. And then because we're using Git, I got to do a sync. So I click Sync here. I click Push here. And that pushes the branch back. It sends the code back to the server. So now if we pop over to our project here and we click Code, now everything's in source control. Okay, now we're ready to start with DevOps. Because so far, this is all pretty cool, but this isn't just DevOps. DevOps starts with version control. So the next thing we want to do in our journey of DevOps is we want to set up this famous CI/CD pipeline. The CI is continuous integration. This means that when you check in code and send it up to the server is going to take your code and everybody else's code that's been checked in and build the solution. Two things will happen. It builds, good. It fails, bad, right? So continuous integration says to everybody, make your changes locally, run your unit tests locally, be convinced that your code locally is perfect. Of course it isn't. It ran on my machine. Send it up to the server, gather everybody else's code, build the whole thing, and see if anybody broke the build. See if the build broke. Did the build break because it was somebody's fault? Maybe. Did the build break and it wasn't really anybody's fault? Of course. So this gives us the ability to have multiple people writing code. Could be in the same building, could be on different sides of the planet, doesn't matter. And when everyone's checked in, we continue building. So every time somebody commits, we build, right? So I can commit my code at the end of my day, build. The folks in China can commit their code at the end of their day, build. Then I come in, commit my code, gives us the ability to do that, and then determine if the build was broken. How would we do this without an automated process? It would be somebody's job to gather the code and manually build constantly around the clock. Why don't we just automate that? That's what we're going to do. So let's go over to here, and I'm going to now pin this to the start. I'm sorry? Windows key plus. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So under builds and release, I'm going to go to builds. Now there are a couple ways that we can build builds. A build definition automates the process. The build definition does what I just said we were going to do. So let's create a new definition. Now there's a couple things you can do. You can start with an empty process and build this yourself, because the build process consists of a bunch of tasks. And if you look at some older books, or there's a very, very excellent course on edX on Introduction to DevOps that I have a pointer to in the reference, where that's what you do. You build the build definition piece by piece, or you can choose from one of the existing templates, which will automate this stuff for us. So there's templates for Visual Studio, ASP, UWP, some Xamarin stuff, Android, Jenkins. There's all kinds of stuff in here. I'm going to choose the ASP.NET template, because that's what we're building. It's in preview, although I haven't discovered it having any issues. Okay, so what it does is Windows Plus, right? Well, that's not working. Oh, there we go. It did work. Okay, so this build now says, first we're going to get our sources from this project, or we can point to a GitHub repo, or we can point out to Subversion so we can get our code from other places. Next up, we're going to restore our NuGet packages, because you kind of have to do that before you build. Then we're going to build the solution using Visual Studio 2017. I could select other versions, although I suspect that because I built this in 2017, it probably isn't going to build in 2012. So I think I'll just leave it at 2017 here. Then we're going to run our unit tests. And this is an important part about the continuous integration. Not only are we going to build the application, but we're going to run all the unit tests at the same time, which is good. Then we're going to publish the symbols and publish the artifact, which means create the things that you would copy somewhere in order to deploy this. So because this is a web application, it's obviously the pieces of the web app. If we were doing this with a WinForms application, it would be an executable. If we were doing this with a WPF, it would be the executable. So we can actually build the thing that gets deployed. Okay, so those are the tasks, and there's a whole bunch of additional tasks. Again, if you're doing this by hand, there's all kinds of additional things that you can add to this build. The ones we've selected will do fine for now. There's additional things you can do, like add variables, and then under triggers, I'm going to turn on continuous integration. So this says when I check in code, run this build definition. By default, the build definition would only run when you manually start it. So by turning on the trigger, continuous integration, now this will automatically run when I check in code. There's options for the agent that gets used, how long we want to retain this, history, etc. But this is good. So let's save this, and let's also queue it, which means let's run one. Okay, so we'll now queue this. Uh-oh, what happened? No agent could be found. Okay, so I guess that's why this is in preview. And that is the default agent needs to be hosted. There is a hosted 2017, but that's if you're building .NET Core applications. So I'm going to select hosted here. And now, there's the save. Save it and queue it. There we go. And now the build is waiting. We're initializing an agent, so we're waiting for an agent on the server to start up. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't necessarily do this. You wouldn't start a build and then sit here at your computer staring at this. But for our purposes here, we're actually going to do this several times during this talk. Okay, the agent's been initialized. Now we're initializing the job. Uh-oh. This looks very different from what I'm expecting. There we go. Get sources. Excellent. Now we're doing the NuGet restore. So you can see restoring all the NuGet packages. Next thing is we're building the solution using Visual Studio Build. Okay. Solution building. And when that succeeds, we're running the tests. Remember, there were 3 tests. These are now executing. Past index, past about, past contact. The tests all ran. We're publishing the symbols path, publishing the artifact, doing the post-job cleanup, and the build succeeded. Woohoo! Now, how do we know? We know because we can go look and see that the build succeeded. We can drill down on that, see that it succeeded. look at the detailed report and see that the tests all passed. We will also get an email. Visual Studio Online at Microsoft.com sends me an email telling me that it succeeded and 100% of the tests passed. And Visual Studio, which is currently disconnected, that's not good. Or maybe that's an old message. Visual Studio will eventually tell me, although we're not going to necessarily wait for that because sometimes that takes a little bit longer. Okay, so now what we've done is we've created a build definition. We've tested it, so now let's check out continuous integration. So I'm going to come back into Visual Studio, and I'm going to make a code change. I'm going to come into the home controller, and where this is your application description page, this was happening a lot when I was practicing this in the speaker room, that Visual Studio would kind of hang and disconnect every time, which never once happened back in Redmond as I was testing this, or at home over and over again, but has been happening here. So Visual Studio is busy. All right, I'm just going to stop it and start it up again. Right? Happily, it never messed up the demo. It just takes time. Okay, so let's start up Visual Studio again. And then it usually tries to reconnect back up to team system. Connecting, so it's going to ask me to log in. Which works better if I spell my username correctly. Okay, so now we're going to connect back to Visual Studio Team Services. And again, I don't know why it's choosing to do this today. I'm going to blame the hotel network. Murphy's Law, yeah. Okay, so now we're connected to Visual Studio Team Services. Let's open up that web app, which I think is this web application 1. Pretty sure. So now, down here in the bottom, Visual Studio is now telling me that the build succeeded, the one we just did. Okay, so now, let's go in and make a code change. Your application will eventually do something useful. Okay, cool. Now I'm busy. I got to get out of here because I got a Mariners game to go to. And so I don't have time to run my unit tests. They'll all succeed. Everybody knows that. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to come in here, go to Changes, enter a comment, enhanced the About page. I'm going to commit. I'm going to sync. I'm going to push. It's good. I'm going to sprint out the door, right? What could possibly go wrong? Now, if we switch back to Visual Studio Team Services and we look, we can see that another build is in progress because I checked in code that kicks off the continuous integration, which kicks off the build. It's this one, number 2 here. We can go look at it. Again, we typically wouldn't do that unless we were just unbelievably bored. Now it started, it's going to go through the same process, initializing the job and getting the code and restoring the NuGets and building the solution and running all the tests. It is building the solution at this point. And then it's going to run the tests. Uh-oh is right. Build failed. And I will eventually get an email to that effect, which is I'm sitting at Safeco Field watching the Mariners like I did Saturday when they lost 16-1 and I had plenty of time to play with my phone. I would see that I got an email telling me the build failed. Come on, send it. Okay, that'll arrive shortly. And then Visual Studio would also tell me why. Why? Well, if we dig in here to this build, we can see that tests failed. And if we go into the detail report, we can see that one of the tests failed, 2 of 3 passed. The about test failed because the test actually expects that text, which I just changed. Okay? So think about this. One way to look at this is I have now been caught out in front of my entire team for being a dork. I broke the build because I didn't run my unit tests. I am shamed. Now, so you're asking yourself, so let me get this straight. Continuous integration was invented because people are too lazy to run their unit tests. No, not really. I could have broken the build in spite of the fact that my unit tests succeeded. I just chose this as an example because it's easy to do. But here's another scenario. I write my code. I write the client side that calls a service. I've got a mock service. I write my code. All of my tests succeed. I check my code in. You write the service. You changed an interface. I didn't get that memo. There was a miscommunication, or I didn't understand you were going to do that, or you forgot that somebody was calling it. It doesn't matter. All of your unit tests work. You check your code in, but the build fails. This is the beauty of continuous integration, right? It's not just because lazy programmers who are late to a Mariners game won't run their unit tests. It's because anything can happen, even if it doesn't necessarily happen on my machine. So the beautiful thing about continuous integration is I write a small amount of code, I check it in. You write a small amount of code, you check it in, the tests run, the build fails, we're alerted immediately, we can find out why. Turns out, could be my fault, could be your fault, could be nobody's fault. It's not even about fault, it's about a better process. Now, it could be about fault. We could decide to set up a kangaroo court, and in this case, it turned out to be entirely your fault because you didn't send the email, so you have to put $1 into the kitty, right? Okay, so what are we going to do about this? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Visual Studio, which now tells me the build failed. There should be an email. There it is. It tells me the build failed. So I'll come back here. I'll fix it. Oh. There's Visual Studio not responding. Okay. Oh, there, it stopped working automatically. I didn't even have to kill it. Okay, so now we'll restart Visual Studio, which again means that we'll have to reconnect. Okay, oh, looks like it might have connected. All right, let's open up this project. Let's go back into here, and it was under controllers. And what's it supposed to say? Let's go check the test. It's supposed to say your application description page. Okay. Now, here, maybe what I'll do, and I can change the test, but let's just change the text back to the way it was. Okay, save this. I'd run my unit tests, but they would work. So now I'm going to come back in here, go to Changes. Okay, resolved about page anomaly. Commit that. sync push. Okay, which will, back in Visual Studio Team Services, start another build, which is now in progress, and assuming that I typed description page correctly, that will work. Okay, so let's not go through that. Let's switch back to slides. Let's talk about this a little bit. So what have we gained from this? What we have gained from this is a process where we can all work on our code, we can all run our tests, we can all write great code. So when we check our code in, the entire system is built, and if any problems result, then we're immediately notified. This gives us the ability to automate this process and to do smaller incremental commits, and therefore builds of smaller pieces of code. Gives us the ability to make a few changes, a number of changes. Maybe we take 3 weeks, and after those 3 weeks, we have a new build that's ready to go out. All right? It makes it a lot easier for us to move into this more rapid cadence than it would if we had to do everything from hand. Okay, so that's continuous integration. Now what we've managed to do is build it, but we haven't deployed it. The other half of the CI/CD pipeline is the continuous delivery. And what continuous delivery does is provide us a process to not only build and test, configure, but also deploy from the build into a production environment, or, as we'll see shortly, into a staging environment. You can decide where to deploy. You might just deploy to production, you might deploy to a staging environment for additional testing, and then send it off to the deployment environment. And the goal is to achieve the shortest path from the availability of new code sitting in version control to actually being able to package this thing up and deploy it. So you minimize the time to deploy, you minimize the time to mitigate, and the time to remediate. So it turns out there's a bug, there's a button that's mislabeled, or there's a line of code that calculates something wrong. Somebody goes, makes the change, checks in, build, deploy, all very rapidly. Okay, so let's go see about continuous delivery. Now if we come back here, of course that build succeeded as we would have predicted. Number of builds, 2? I count 3, that's interesting. There we go, 3. And that one build that I messed up just sits there always showing up, mocking me. I call it the red line of shame because I didn't run my unit tests. I've learned. Right? Because I didn't run my unit test, I probably had to put $20 into the kitty. You only had to put 1 in for a lack of communication. That can happen anytime, but I didn't run my unit tests. We're not going to stand for that. All right. So now, continuous deployment is all about releases. So we go to releases here, and we'll create a new release definition. So this is part of release management, giving us the ability to automate the deployment and testing of our software in multiple environments. We're just going to stick to a single environment right now. Release management is a broader thing of managing releases along with environments and configurations. We're not going to get into any of that today. We're just going to focus on the continuous delivery part. We're going to create a new release definition, which you can also do by hand. Start with an empty definition and add a bunch of tasks, or even easier is use one of these new templates. Now, for deploying to IIS, we can do that right here. We can select IIS website and SQL database deployment, but because I didn't feel like setting up IIS in this machine and I already have Azure, I'm going to deploy this to an Azure web app. Now, if I'm going to deploy it to an Azure web app, I should probably go create one, because I think I tore down all of my Azure web apps. So let's quickly pop over into Azure. And if you have an MSDN subscription, you have $150 a month of Azure you can use, which is pretty much enough to constantly learn. I've got 77, 73 remaining on mine, and it's May 22nd, so I will make it through the month with 150. Once, in all the years I've had the $150, I ran out once because I created a service and I accidentally left it running, and then with about a week and a half to go in the month, I ran out of credit. So if you're careful enough, then $150 is more than enough. You can sign up for Dev Essentials, get $25 a month of Azure, or if you have a subscription to Visual Studio Pro with MSDN, then you get $100 a month. Okay, so let's create a new web app, someplace to put this. MVC application. And I'm going to call it Orlando DevOps. Will that work? That looks like it works. Using that subscription, create a new resource group and select a service plan. And I'm going to use this one, default 0S1, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Pin it to the dashboard, create it. And that's going to create in Azure a web app that I can shortly deploy this MVC application to. Okay, it just takes a couple seconds. There, deployment succeeded. And the URL is orlandodevops.azurewebsites.net, which if I go to, we can see is a running website with nothing on it at the moment, which is good. Okay, so now switch back to Visual Studio Team Services and finish creating our release definition. I'm going to select Azure App Service Deployment to deploy my web app. Click Next. Choose a source that publishes the artifact. Could be from a build definition. I could hook up with something like Jenkins or other providers. I'm going to select continuous deployment because after I do the continuous integration, I also want to do the continuous deployment, not only have the app built, but then also sent to the Azure website. That's optional. And I'll click Create. And now what I need to do is I'm connecting to Azure. It wants to know, okay, who are you? What subscription are you using? Here's a tip on this. It takes a while for this drop down to load. So if you click it immediately, nothing shows up. Give it a couple seconds and your subscriptions will appear. Because I'm signed into VSTS, it's smart enough to retrieve my subscriptions from Azure. I'll select this subscription. Then I authorize. So even though I am signed in to Visual Studio Team Services, doesn't prove that I have access to this Azure site, so I need to sign into Azure as well. That's good security. Then I'm going to select my app service. Which is, there's all the ones I have. What did I call this? Orlando DevOps. That's the name of my web app. Okay? And that's good. So I'm going to save. And then I'm going to go to Release, and I'm going to select Create Release. I want to test this, so I'm actually going to click Create and deploy this. It's already been built. I'm going to deploy it to the Azure web app. And if I come back to the release definition, I can see that there is a deployment in progress. Now, this page doesn't seem to refresh on its own, so you do kind of have to refresh the page repeatedly. I couldn't find anywhere where you could monitor this. There might be one, I just haven't seen it yet. And because I'm impatient in watching over it, I'm just going to continually refresh this until it either gets tired of being nagged or works, whichever happens first. I can edit the release definition from here. Oh, come on, you're not done yet? I'm expected to be patient. Any questions yet? We'll fool it into thinking that we're being patient. Any questions at the moment? Good question. What if you're doing a lot of branches? Do you recommend continuously integrating on the various branches or just the master branch? It kind of depends on remembering that the point of the continuous integration is to check in smaller amounts and run the unit test. So if you're iterating on a branch and you're testing and you don't necessarily think that all of the tests are going to run correctly, you're just checking your code in as a way of doing that as a best practice, then you might not set up a build for that. Or you might say, look, it's code. It should always run, expecting that your tests are going to fail most of the time until they succeed. So you can kind of figure out what the best. I mean, the worst that happens is you check in the code, the build runs, and it fails. On the other hand, if that's going to eat up a lot of resources, and potentially, ultimately, if it eats up processing money, then you might decide not to do that. So it really kind of depends on. Uh-oh. That doesn't look good. It failed. Why did it fail? Oh, so that was the build. Let's go back to the release. The release definition. Let's find this release. Why would you have failed? Huh. What happened? This should have worked. Maybe it just timed out. Let's create another one. The build worked, right? Build 3, did that succeed? Build 3 succeeded. Okay. Did I call this? I called this Orlando DevOps, right? Yep. Okay. That wasn't the problem. If this fails, we'll delete it and try it again. There we go. It worked. That's what I get for being impatient. Okay, so now we go to this site, refresh the browser, and in our Azure web app is the MVC app streaming down locally. Okay, perfect. Now, let's see the whole thing in action. We pop over to Visual Studio. We will make a change that I guarantee will not break the build. I'm going to change this from application name to my cool. You're killing me. promise you, until I got here this morning, I'd never seen this happen. Now it's happening every single time. Okay, we connected. Looks like we're connected. It's taking less time to recover than it used to, so that's good. All right, call up the application. All right, so go into the views, layout, change it from application name to my cool app. Save it. Changes. Enhanced home page. Check it in by committing, syncing, pushing. Okay, then we pop over to here and we go to our builds, and there is a build in progress because we checked in code. And we'll just watch it. Any other questions while we wait for that to go? I think we're good on time. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions or resources on databases? Because that's the most difficult.
Databases, yes, database DevOps. There's a couple ways to do database DevOps. There's the way that the SQL Server database tools do them, and then there's also the way that Redgate does them. Redgate ships a couple of their database DevOps tools in Visual Studio Enterprise. I just did a couple of episodes of Visual Studio Toolbox on that. So Wednesday, which is tomorrow, if I believe, I'm going to post the episode that shows you how the SQL Server database tools do database DevOps. And then next Wednesday, there'll be an episode on how the Redgate guys do that. So that's what I'd recommend. It was actually amazing. I hadn't really ever discovered or looked into database DevOps. And it turns out that you can basically treat all of your, it gives you the ability to make changes to the database in a fast release cadence fashion using essentially the same DevOps tools. It's really, really cool. Like I never really thought about that. I guess I'm from the old school where you build a database, right? And then it just pretty much stays because you designed it properly. I mean, why do you need to add stuff to the database, right? It's like, it's like, what, the oil filter in your car or something? Is there a piece of the car that never needs to be changed? Well, it's like the oil filter on my lawnmower, which hasn't been changed in 10 years. You just do it once and leave it, right? And then it turns out that there's tools that give you the ability to be much more agile about it. So they're pretty cool. The SQL Server database tools, which are included, and then the Redgate tools are included in Enterprise 2017. Core versions of them. There's more full-featured versions that they obviously charge for, but you get free tooling. And if you just want to check those out, you could download the trial of Enterprise 2017 and check those out and then decide if that's the way you want to go. Okay. This is now testing. Any other questions while this spins its way to completion? Okay, so hopefully, as we're doing this, you're thinking about the way that you build software and thinking about how you might adopt this. And it really is applicable even if you're the only person working on a project. Even if it's just you, I would highly recommend kind of adopting this because it gets you more into the thought process of how you do quicker, how you get into a faster release cadence, and it saves you the process of starting the build and then starting the tests and then starting the deployment, right? You can easily, from inside Visual Studio, right-click and publish to Azure, right? So it's not like what this thing is doing is any different. It's using the exact same scripts that Visual Studio uses to publish to Azure, right? There's an API for publishing to Azure. This is the same thing running here. But the nice thing is that this just automates it for you and gets you more into that mindset. Huh. Yes.
DevOps, he actually throws stuff. From what I've seen now, this is more like the developer can do all by himself. So where
Okay, so where does the IT come? The IT part comes in when you get a little bit more to things like release management, infrastructure as code, configuration management. So the idea is that what would you check into source code? You check in everything, not just the code you write, but the scripts that would create the various environments. So we would also, and it's the next demo, if this one continues, is go into Azure and say, look, right now we're publishing to the production website. We should probably publish to a staging server first. So we'd go into Azure and enable slots on that web app, and then just have the build, the release definition point to the staging server, right? And then when we make a change, it goes on the staging server, and then we could do a manual swap to get it to go to the production server, which would typically not be something that the developer, him or herself, would have the ability to do. You would have somebody whose job it was, potentially manually, potentially automate it, to promote something from the staging server to the production server, but also in terms of configuration. So we'll have a couple staging servers. We have a production server. You want the environment to be exactly the same so that when you test in the staging server, you're literally testing on the same type of machine as you'd see in production, right? You don't want a situation where it doesn't work in production because that machine had less memory than your staging server or was running a different version of the framework or something. So when you get into that kind of stuff, configuration management, infrastructure as code, that's sort of more the IT side of it, right? Admittedly, here I'm focusing on the developer side of it. And I don't know what happened here. That's not very nice. Okay, well, I'm going to cancel that because I don't really want to watch it. So what would happen is that change would be sent to here, and this would say my cool application. And then what I would show is coming in here and choosing a deployment slot. I can just add a slot, which I would call staging. Okay, so now I've got a deployment slot called staging, and the URL for that is Orlando DevOps-staging azurewebsites.net. And if I call that up, again, I'll have a web app that looks like this other one. Now, to do that, I do need to mention that you need to pick the right plan. Usually, when I'm doing Azure, I try to pick the cheapest plan I can get, so I would choose something like Basic, which is $32 a month. But if you want slots, you have to go to at least the standard 1 plan, which is a little bit more expensive. Okay, and there you get 5 slots. So just something to keep in mind. Particularly if you're, using your 25, your 25 a month wouldn't cover these, but if you're using your 100 a month or 150 a month, just be aware of that. And then if you're just practicing with it, you should probably turn these off or even delete them so they don't continue to eat the money. Just be wary, be careful or cognizant of whether or not you're going to blow through your 150. So now, come back to the release. Definition, and just check right here, deploy to slot. And then the resource group is Orlando DevOps, and the slot is staging. And now, when I build this, it will wind up going to the staging server. So I make changes, I go through the build, I go through the release, that winds up on the staging server. And then to swap them, oops, it's very easy to just pop over into Azure. And for my deployment slots, just click swap, which you can also automate with a script. You don't literally have to come into Azure and click that button. But for our demo purposes here, I was just going to click that swap button, and then the change we made, which went to the staging server, got sent over to the production server, and whatever's on the production server got sent over to the staging server. Okay? Okay, so now, oh, we got time, so let's do this. Let's create a brand new MVC app. We'll call it Web App 4. I'm not going to add it to source control at the moment. I do want unit tests. I want to show you how this gets even easier if you have Visual Studio 2017, because there is an extension called the Continuous Delivery Tools. So if you go to Tools and Extensions, oh, yeah. At least it's consistent. Okay, that was Web Application 4, which is currently not in source control, not hooked up to anything. Okay, if I go to Tools, Extensions, and I go search online for continuous, and I've already installed it, I'll find the Continuous Delivery Tools for Visual Studio, which gives me the ability to right-click on the solution and configure continuous delivery. Continuous delivery, mind you. So the first thing it says is you need to add this project to source control. So I'll click on that. And then I'm going to publish this up to Team Services. I'm going to sign in. And I'm going to create an entirely brand new project, which we'll call Web Application 4. Click Publish Repository. And that's going to take this code and create a new Visual Studio Team Services project and check this code into there, unless it blows up first. Oh, what happened? No, not sure what happened. Successfully pushed to origin, but I don't think that I am hooked up to. So let's go. Let's just go to my main page and see if that got created. Nope, it didn't. Okay, well, so if I configure continuous delivery, okay, so now it's going to connect to Web Application 4, master branch on this subscription, create a new app service, and when I click OK, it's going to create the continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. It's going to basically do everything we just did earlier, but do it all from inside Visual Studio. All right? It takes a while, so we'll just let it run. But if you're using Visual Studio 2017, highly recommend getting that extension because it just automates a lot of the stuff that we did. And I thought, selecting pre-existing templates was pretty easy, and then I saw this tool makes it even easier. Okay, so that's that. Demo of that. Okay, so a couple of additional concepts which we've talked to, this idea of infrastructure as code, where your infrastructure, the networks you're on, VMs, connections, etc., you basically express as code or as a descriptive model. Check that into source control, because then that gives you the ability to create consistent environments over time. And if you change an environment, you change that script, check it back in, and then next time you create that environment, next time you create the environment, then you get the new one you've asked for. So you can use this in conjunction with continuous delivery to make sure that when you publish that code, when you release that code or publish that code, you're releasing it into a known environment, which then eliminates the risk of something working in test but not working in production because the environment differed, right? And those can sometimes be the hardest things to hunt down. Okay. Now, of course, monitoring is also an important part of this. You've seen this in the mobile demos. You can do it, obviously, in web applications as well. You want to know what issues users are running into. If users are running into crashes or the app's misbehaving, the sooner you know about it, the faster you can do something about it. And users will report things sometimes, but the user says, oh, I clicked the button and it didn't work, right? It's not exactly action. How many times has somebody called you for support and they said it didn't work, right? What didn't work? Well, the dialogue, did you see a dialogue? No, I got a message. I got some message, right? Right? Doesn't give you any information. So if you're monitoring using something like Application Insights or whatever, then you can be getting the feedback which tells you where the crashes are occurring, and then you can go fix the issues and get a new release back out to solve the problem. Minimize the time to detect and the time to mitigate. So the more data you get, and if you can start getting it automatically, the faster you can fix things, the faster you can get fixes out there. The users don't even necessarily need to be involved. Crashes are occurring that the user didn't even notice. You fix it, get the new release out there, and head off problems at the pass, if you will. So, we're blue now. We're off the bunny slope. This is DevOps. We just did DevOps. 70 minutes from what the heck is this thing to, oh, is that all it is? I can do that, right? This is blue skiing, if you will. That's what DevOps is about. Now, are we good DevOps practitioners at the moment? No, we're beginners. Do we understand the best practices? No, of course not. Is there a heck of a lot left to learn? Absolutely. But my goal here was to demystify it and give us a sense of how to get started doing it, what these terms are, like continuous integration, continuous delivery, CD pipelines. Before you learn something, it can all seem pretty daunting and pretty kind of black diamond. It really isn't. Some of the advanced stuff obviously is, but this is the basics, and what I hope we've accomplished here is I've given you not only the better understanding of this, but the ability to go start playing around with this yourselves. And I know that I do way more of this than I ever used to do once I learned this much and discovered it really wasn't all that difficult to get started. Some resources, really good documentation on the Visual Studio site and the Visual Studio Team Services sites. I know, how often do you have a speaker stand up here and say really good docs? But our docs team at Microsoft over the last couple of years has worked really, really, really hard at improving the docs, and they're really good at this point. And then I also recommend on edX a course called Introduction to DevOps by Stephen Borgen from Northwest Cadence. The Screenshots, it's a couple years old, so the screenshots are a little out of date. The hands-on labs that you go through are a couple years old. So, when you build your build definition and your release definition, you start from scratch and you add tasks one at a time because those templates didn't exist. It's all correct, it still works, but it's a lot easier now. But the concepts and the way he explains it are fantastic. So I highly recommend that. And again, any questions you have, don't hesitate to email me, rogreen@microsoft.com. Hope you enjoyed that, and have a great rest of the show.